Hey, solopreneurs, Gabe here. Today we have Dr. Jerome D. Lubbe. He is known as the patient doctor of Thrive Neuro Health LLC. He's going to talk about how to understand our weaknesses and build around them for business success. It's a great conversation with an interesting story that I can't wait for you to hear. Jerome, thank you for being on the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me, Gabe. What a gift, man.
I tell you what, I'm excited to have you on. Your story, which we're going to get to in a little bit, is I think going to catch people's attention, which I think is going to be fantastic. It's going to be great to have you on this podcast because we're going to talk about how to understand our weaknesses and build around them for ultimate success in our businesses. But I have to say, we got to go to your story. So help me understand your story. What brings you here today?
It's fascinating. I always joke with folks that it either sounds like a comedy of errors or B-rate movie that never got made. But I don't look the part when people see me. But I'm actually originally born in South Africa in a rural part called Benoni. Immigrated to the U.S. to Knoxville, Tennessee, in the early '90s on asylum status as a refugee kid with $100, two suitcases, a bipolar grandmother, and a parrot. When we landed in Knoxville, Tennessee in January of 1990, my dad was 35. He'd never seen snow, and we were not properly dressed. And in that particular place, it just happened to be snowing that day. So interestingly enough, in my history, I'm an African refugee kid from Congo, from Zaire when it was still called Zaire. But what happened was my family immigrated over on asylum status because my dad was working in a place in Zaire that just didn't necessarily let you resign. So when we came over, we started from scratch. My dad was a blacksmith and a foundryman, and my twin brother, I have an identical twin brother. My twin brother, my older brother, and we got the fortune of having a good working relationship with my dad, which was if we worked in his foundry every day, we got to eat dinner. So it felt like a good trade. So we learned behavioral economy really quickly, and you get what you work for, and you earn what you work for. But I grew up in an apprenticeship culture. My dad passed away when I was a freshman in high school from congestive heart failure. The joys of smoking 2 packs a day for 30 years and then working in a foundry with a bunch of metal particulate ended up with a pretty heavy duty case of what's similar to like a coal mine or something. So I was a 14-year-old, lost my dad who was 43. My brothers and I started working full time. So we understood working full time from 8 years old, but not getting paid for it. So when we got into the opportunity to work full time at 14, we worked at restaurants. I did restaurant industry for a long time, but I actually ended up moving into digital animation and special effects production. So I went to school for graphic design, digital animation, and film. Ended up doing music full time with my brothers, and we had an incredible opportunity. But also got married young. Got married at 21. And what ended up happening and intersecting in these spaces is I started developing some pretty intense complex issues as a patient, specifically around complex migraines at 17. Went on a 10-year journey, spending over $100,000 as a patient, seeing 21 specialists to get a diagnosis that once it was named, no one knew what to do with it. And it turns out in hindsight, what had happened was I was run over by a car 6 months after we got to the States when I was 8. Under one bumper to the other, and miraculously ended up surviving. I joke with folks, I'm the only person I know that was run over by a car and then subsequently spanked by my dad for being run over by that car. And that's because when you're on asylum status as a refugee family, you don't know exactly how hospitals work. So it was a really interesting situation, but had a closed head injury. Fortunately, just by sheer miracle, ended up being okay. But ended up having 2 concussions in high school. Was hit by a drunk driver when I was 17 and 20. And by the time I walked into 21 when I got married, my body had been through some stuff. And what ended up happening is that the music career ended abruptly overnight due to someone getting cancer. The digital animation degree ended abruptly when my wife and I got married. She was 19, I was 21. We took full guardianship of her 12-year-old brother. And we ended up raising him. So I put the digital animation on hold. The music ended. And by the time that David, my wife's younger brother, moved out of high school into college, I was in this space where I had some really incredible things happen, some really amazing opportunities. But I didn't have anything left to hold on to in terms of a job that was focused, a pursuit, or a career or passion. I certainly wasn't financially stable. We didn't grow up around money, so that wasn't part of the context. But I was trying to figure out, where do I go next? And what ended up happening was I decided that I would become a doctor because I couldn't find a good one. And I started a journey of moving into healthcare, specifically focusing on complex, unresolved cases, especially mental health. So a lot of my history and a lot of my grandmother's history and a lot of other spaces. So just decided that I would become a doctor. And then over the last 7 years of being in practice, have taken that journey over the last 13 years and turned it into something that's been profoundly life-giving to be able to support people in similar situations to me, because even now I still average about 80 to 100 full-blown migraines per calendar year, about 200 to 250 headaches per calendar year. So it ends up that I'm about 10 to 15 days out of the year that I do not have a headache or a migraine. So I always tell folks, every day that I wake up, I'm both a patient and a doctor. And my goal is to figure out how to navigate these spaces for both myself and the people that I come into contact with. That's kind of how we got here. A little bit of that journey.
Wow. So I have a few things that I got to pull out of that. But the first thing is especially for the listeners going, okay, this is crazy. One, how did you get run over by a car and live? I mean, how did you end up getting in front of a car to get run over?
Yeah, so this is the comedy of errors, because one, my twin brother was highly distractible, and we joke around about that. But two, when you're immigrant kids, you don't have any money. So my dad went to a Goodwill, got a small little BMX bike for $10, but it was the one bike for the three brothers. My older brother was inside, and my twin brother and I were outside in this driveway in a place called Maryville, Tennessee. And if you know anybody in that area, it's called Murrayville. So you're in Murrayville, Tennessee. And I come flying out of the driveway, and he's supposed to stand at the end of the driveway as a spotter and tell you if a car is coming because you're on a residential side street. Well, he got distracted, and I ended up flying out of the driveway without the heads up that there was a car coming. Fortunately, this is a side street, one of those rare occasions where somebody's actually going an appropriate speed limit. It's going about 30, 35 miles an hour. But I just met him right on the front bumper. And what ended up happening was I slid underneath the car. And where the miracle is that the back tire hooked underneath the carriage of the car and actually popped the car over the top. So I ended up underneath the car just a little bit high enough, didn't hit my head, hit the side of my body, hit my head on the ground, but actually literally ended up sitting up, seated behind the car. And I'll never forget, the guy jumps out of the car and he is absolutely convinced that he has killed me. I mean, he's just run over an 8-year-old on a bicycle. But the bike is wedged underneath the car like a U shape, like it had created this cone. So I ended up having a closed head injury from obviously smacking the pavement, and ended up with pretty significant bruising and damage on my left hand, but didn't manage to break anything. Just ended up with a pretty severe concussion. But by some miracle, the bike ended up just properly creating a nice cone over the top of me, and it was one of the strangest, most unlikely, improbable things that I think anybody could experience.
Wow. That is amazing. Absolutely amazing. And then how about then hit by drunk drivers twice, not once, but twice, 17 and 20. Um, Dude, you're lucky you're alive.
I am, and the craziest part, when I was 17, and again, it's one of those things where you're talking life has changed not in a second, but in a moment. I mean, in a millisecond. Like if I had adjusted the speed of the bike, or he had adjusted the speed of the car, I wouldn't have been under the car. I would have been under a tire, and that would have been different, right?
Mhm.
But when I was 17, I after my dad had passed away, we all worked our own jobs. We made our own money. We helped support our family. And I told my mom, I want to get a Mustang. I'm 17. It's 1998, and I want to get a 1999. I want to get a Mustang. So I bought a Mustang. We went to a youth group in North Georgia, Chattanooga, Tennessee area. And every time that I pulled into the parking lot on a Sunday evening, I'd gun it because there's gravel in the parking lot and an open field behind me, so I could rooster tail it. And I knew I wouldn't hurt anybody because I'm a very considerate person. So I'm happy to drive fast and happy to rooster tail gravel, just as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else that goes into an open field. And I'll never forget, there's a buddy of mine who's sitting in the car next to me. His name is Johnny Boatfield. He went by Boat. And he asked me a question as I was about to do this gas pedal gun it into the parking lot like I normally do. And I turned to the right to answer the question, got distracted, forgot to hit the gas, and just started drifting into the parking lot. And as we're drifting into the parking lot, the next thing I know, we're spinning like a top in the middle of the road, and the entire front end of the Mustang, including the engine, has been taken off of the car. And what ended up happening was a drunk driver overtook me on the left to try and pass me, but he overtook me on the left as I was turning into the parking lot. But he was going at such a high speed, he managed to take the engine and the front end of the car off so cleanly, it didn't even damage the driver's side door or break the window. So it was one of those things where, again, the joys of whiplash and concussion and smacking your head against things. But if I'd even breathed on the gas pedal, just even remotely, he would have met the driver's side door instead of the front of the car. So it's these things where I keep getting these constant reminders that some significant things have happened, but just a moment different, just a millisecond different, and we wouldn't be having a podcast conversation. I wouldn't be married
Mm.
for 17 years with 3 kids. I'd be gone at 8 or 17, and ironically enough, I don't know if it's just bad luck or it's just the fact that we've had a consistency of getting into gnarly situations and coming out of them. But both my twin brother, my older brother, and I have had probably 4 to 6 different near-death experiences. Half of them in my dad's foundry growing up, but things where we just shouldn't have made it, and we're still here. Which hasn't made life easier as a result. Obviously, it's just put it into perspective. I think sometimes people hear that story and they're like, wow, life must be great when you have that perspective. I'm like, that perspective has been wonderful and it's been insightful, but it's also the exact reason I ended up becoming a patient. So it's both helpful and also consequential. So it's been interesting. I can tell you that much.
Boy, yeah, definitely. And I'm curious. I want to know about your practice and what you're doing, but I also have this little piece of me that wants to know what kind of music did you play? What was your instrument, or what did you do in the band?
Yeah, so I was a harmony vocalist. So I always have a little bit of resistance to saying I'm a musician because both my brothers play guitar and piano and sang lead. But they're quick. They're quick to correct me and telling me that harmony vocals is a musician or is an instrument. But interestingly enough, none of us did music. After my dad passed away, none of us were trained in music. None of us understood music. But my older brother and my twin brother both picked up a guitar in college to impress a girl, and they started writing and playing, and they realized they were pretty good, and they got together in Atlanta and said, hey, we should write music together. And I'm sitting there watching them, and classic, the way that our family's always been, and you show up and you do work and you support. They said, you can't just watch. And I said, I don't play any instruments. And I will just figure out a harmony. I was like, I've never sang harmonies in my life. Turns out that with two brothers singing and us having similar vocal cords, harmonies were actually really, really easy to find, and ended up doing harmony vocals with them. But we had some really amazing experiences. We kind of were a singer songwriter, John Mayer's, Dave Matthews, Zach Brown kind of experience. But we even had probably, I think, one of the most serendipitous kind of things that ever happened was we got to open for the Beach Boys on a 4th of July concert called Stadium of Fire in Provo, Utah. And as immigrant kids, doing the largest 4th of July concert opening for the Beach Boys was about as just poetic as you could get. Obviously, my dad wasn't there; he had passed. But I remember sitting on that field, going, I don't think we expected when we moved to the country that we'd be doing music and opening in front of 65,000 people. And most people, the funny thing is, as a clinician, most people have no idea that I used to do music full time. So, but the music's been a really fun, big part of the journey for sure.
Wow, that is amazing. You actually just listed off three of my favorite bands. John Mayer, not necessarily a band, but John Mayer, Dave Matthews is my absolute favorite, and then Zach Brown band. I discovered Zach Brown about 3, 4 years ago, and I absolutely just love those guys. They're just it's a similar type of music across the board, but I really like it. So that's interesting. Very cool.
Yeah, man, and we were fortunate. The last album that Clay Cook recorded before he joined Zach Brown was my brothers and I's. And Clay Cook is the harmony vocalist and guitarist and about 11 other instruments as well. But he's looks like a small, burly little lumberjack, and Zach Brown is an amazing guy. So
Yeah, that is really cool. So where are you at today? Tell me about your business. What are you doing today in this world?
Yeah, so in the space that I'm in the moment, as a business owner, I have a couple of different spaces that I work in. One is a clinical arm, and then is one is a non-clinical arm. In the clinical side of things, I run a private practice in Atlanta, Georgia. That is 100% referral based practice that is actually unlisted. Essentially, there's no sign. If you're coming, you are coming because you know that I'm there. And in the clinical world, I specifically support complex unresolved cases. So folks like me who have had a lot of stuff going on, or they're dealing with something very complex that nobody can figure out, or it's been a long road and they haven't really gained any traction. So, for instance, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen an 11-year-old who had a choking event at a fast food restaurant and went 3 months without a single swallow of solid food for a sheer fear of what it would feel like to just swallow. So, panic attacks in an 11-year-old, right? Sensory processing, right? Or last week was a 4-year-old and a 15-year-old nonverbal kids with autism. And the 15-year-old, 6'8", 270 pounds, likes to headbutt and eat garbage, right? So when you're working with a 15-year-old that's big enough to throw me, and I'm 6'2", 280, I'm a big guy, and this kid is huge. And then I work with folks and do a lot of performance enhancement. So for instance, if there's CEOs who are burning the candle at both ends, but they're trying to figure out how to make sure that their body doesn't break down if they can't change their schedule, I can't necessarily give them a pay raise clinically or neurologically, but I can create some margin. So we do a lot of performance enhancement through brain hacks that are drugs and surgery free. So my entire practice is what's known as a drugs and surgery free approach. I'm board certified in functional neurology, physical therapy, chiropractic. I'm board eligible in 6 other areas, including head injury, childhood neurological developmental disorders, movement disorders, a lot of other areas. The easiest way I explain to folks what I do clinically, because I think a lot of times doctors end up self aggrandizing, and I don't even require that people call me doctor. I don't even have a sign up for the clinic. I just tell people I've studied a lot in order to minimize the number of times that I have to tell somebody I don't know what to do and I don't know what that is. Because my experience for so long was we don't know what that is and we don't know what to do. So it just puts me in a situation where essentially I tell people I'm like a personal trainer for the brain. If you come in and you're in the best shape possible and you want to figure out how to be even healthier, cool, we can do that. It's performance enhancement. If you're in the worst shape possible and you're not even sure what question to ask, that puts you into a place to figure out where to go. I'll help you ask those questions. So we really cover the whole gamut. That if you're above ground and you want your brain to work better, we can help you do that. So that's who I am as a clinician, right? Really serving people in becoming healthier versions of themselves. Our tagline at the clinic is optimal function for life, because you may not be able to heal and wellness might not be a part of your journey, but optimal function, we can do that based on where you're at relatively. And then the non-clinical side of things, I do a lot of content creation. My journey has been trying to figure out how to take care of myself as a patient, and doing that through the lens of both a patient lived but a doctor informed and doctor centered conversation. So I create a lot of content around self care and self development through either the brain based Enneagram, which is the first book written on the brain based or neuroscientific approach to the Enneagram. I created that model. I created some profiling models that allow people to understand how to statistically validate what is happening for them through an Enneagram lens. So answering questions like, not only what are you most efficient at, what are you highest in, but what is your lowest efficiency? What's your lowest type, and why might that be really negatively impacting how you show up in the world? So really helping through those, doing e-courses and writing written content, a lot of speaking, teaching, and coaching. But really, at the end of the day, just somebody trying to figure out how to navigate what it looks like to be a patient, a provider, a parent, a partner in terms of my marriage. And I didn't mean to do all the alliteration, but it seems to work there. So those are all the spaces that I'm moving in at the moment.
That's a ton. That is a ton. And your moniker on my intake sheet was the patient doctor. And in our pre-call, we had this conversation a little bit about the patient doctor. So really, what you're saying is, all right, I am a doctor, but I'm also a patient as well. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I tell folks it's like when you go to buy a car with somebody who's been working at a dealership for 30 years and you didn't realize that it could be so easy to buy a car, right? Because they know all the tricks. When somebody comes in and they sit in front of you and they go, I've seen 25 specialists over the last 10 years. You're the first person who I ever feel has listened to my story, who understands what I'm dealing with. In order to do that, we have to take time. My longest encounter with a specialist that I waited 3 hours in the lobby for in 6 months to get into their lobby to wait 3 hours for the conversation was 8 minutes. And I don't care what clinician, what grade or quality of clinician. It's no critique of the clinician themselves. It's more of the system. But to understand a 10-year journey in 8 minutes is a bit difficult.
Yeah. Horribly difficult.
So for me, the biggest part is being able to tell somebody we're going to create space and create margin. So it's more than anything just helping people understand I'm going to be patient as a person, but I'm also a patient who understands from a clinical perspective what it's like to be in your shoes. I've been on the exam table more times than I've been in front of it. So it's just a case of supporting people in a perspective that helps them to understand that I'm partnering with them, and there's somebody who's interested and understands what they're going through.
Very good. Very good. So we're going to talk today about, really how to understand our weaknesses and then build around them for ultimate success in our businesses. And so, you know, share some of the stories, share some of the things that you've learned in your practice and in your running of your businesses that have allowed you to really figure out, okay, this is what I'm good at and this is what I'm not. I mean, help me understand that if you would.
From an experience of what I'm talking about with like what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, I know every business owner is going to have a financial part of what they're looking at. I mean, we're on a podcast about financial health and maturity, and I think one of the things that's really helpful to understand is what is your motivation and what is your connection with money and with making money. Sometimes it can be excessive, sometimes it can be insufficient. For me in particular, I'm not particularly money motivated. I didn't grow up around a lot of money. We didn't grow up around a savings account and a bank account. When my dad passed away, we didn't even have a life insurance policy. So for me, one of the things that I had to understand very, very quickly is I'm not aware of my cost per hour, the cost of running the business, the need to charge people enough. So some of the things that ended up happening was I had to become aware pretty quickly that I need to get some insight on what an hourly rate is, what a monthly and a yearly budget is, what the cost of expenses are, and more than anything, not giving away all of my care. My first year in practice, I gave away 40% of my care. And for the way that I'm wired, I loved the connection with the folks that I was supporting. But as a parent and a spouse and a business owner, that's not sustainable. So I think for some of the things for me, it's just more in a self awareness piece. Going, what is my relative relationship with money in terms of my need to pursue it, my need to avoid it, or my need to stay in contact with it? And for me, it was just a very foreign concept. So it really had to lean into getting a lot more coaching and a lot more education on what it was that I was just completely unaware of.
And how about within your business? Were there things that you realized that you should have been doing or shouldn't have been doing? I mean, obviously, charging people a rate, and then also making sure you charge people, not only charging the right rate, but actually charging them. So, did you bring some people in? Like, did you bring a CFO type person to come in and say, "All right, you need to run your business this way," or what did you end up doing?
Yeah, actually, I ended up doing a couple of things. One, I joined a local mastermind group of people who were specifically running businesses with 10 people or less, both nonprofit and for profit in Atlanta. I think there's a lot of different mastermind groups, but finding a mastermind group, a smaller group, a cohort, I think 10 people or less for me personally was something that I could really connect with and do life with and sharpen against some other folks. But getting in front of people who were asking the questions that I didn't even know to ask as a business owner. Then one on one, getting a business coach, somebody who had some really good understanding of where I wanted to go in terms of vision, but then helping me with the mechanics in that process. Because I don't have any issue with casting a vision and understanding where I want to be 50 years from now, never mind 50 months from now or 50 weeks from now. My ability to think long term and big picture is easy for me, but the mechanics is something, especially from finance. So it was a mastermind group. It was a smaller cohort for me, particularly the way that I'm wired. It was a business coach, and it was making the choice to go. That's a good investment. That money is worth it, because a lot of the times I was hesitant to spend the money, thinking, well, I need that in the first year of practice. But realistically, the best decisions that I made in the first 2 years of practice was paying to get around a group of other guys. It was a minimal cost, but a mastermind group, a business coach, and then probably the most vital decision that I made was to get as much administrative work off of my plate as possible. So I hired an executive assistant, but that executive assistant served the dual purpose of being the patient concierge and also my executive assistant. So she supported me administratively, but then also supported the patients in terms of the concierge and an advocate. And the amount of money that I was spending an hour on her compared to my hourly rate that I was charging clinically was a no brainer. So I just had to quickly look at it and go, how many hours would I need to work in order to do the same amount of work that Janet is doing? And how much is that going to cost me in potential revenue that I can't actually treat someone or serve someone? And I'm spending time doing administrative work. So, I mean, an easy way to look at it is if I'm making $200 an hour and I pay her $20 an hour, I just bought myself 9 hours of freedom, right? So, paying an administrative assistant and paying an executive assistant and spending the time to find somebody good and train them properly. She's been with me for 5 years, and in 5 years, we haven't had a single cancellation ever, which in a clinical practice is unheard of. People don't even believe me. But it's because of some of those things that we did to really set up the business to succeed. And part of that is giving her the opportunity to support me administratively.
That's fantastic, and that's one of the lessons. I ran a How I Built My Band series early in 2021, and what that series was all about was those of us solopreneurs and small business owners need to realize the value of our time. And you hit it perfectly. Your example, if you can bill out at $200 an hour, but you pay her $20 an hour, you just bought yourself a ton of time to be able to get other stuff done. Because what we unfortunately do as solopreneurs, especially solopreneurs, is we feel like we have to do it all, and feel like we have to be an expert in all of it. And that was one of the things we talked about in our pre-call. Help me understand, what was the process for you to kind of get that mindset shift to go, wait, I can't do this all myself. I need somebody else to help me, and I need to be willing to offload it. What were some of the lessons you've learned there, or what were the steps you took?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gib. I mean, transparently, I actually didn't solicit it. It was unsolicited. And I think this is one of the interesting kind of caveats that sometimes isn't taught in business leadership or business ownership is it isn't that you always go out and spontaneously or proactively discover the solution. I think sometimes part of it is being available and being open-handed enough to hear the solution when it's offered to you and not rejecting it out of hand because you didn't create it, right? Or you didn't cultivate it. So for instance, my executive assistant was the mom of an adult patient that I worked with. I can share this because she's given permission to do this and she works with us full time. But realistically, I was doing it all. And I didn't know how to go out and find an executive assistant or go out and do some of these things. And I was able to support both of her adult children. And when I transitioned into private practice, she goes, "Is there anybody helping you? Is there anybody that you're interested in supporting you from an EA standpoint?" I said, I haven't considered it, but yeah, I could definitely use the help. Now, the interesting thing is the day before, my wife and I had met because we have our own kind of State of the Union meetings. She's she's part of the executive team, and we both said, you've been in practice for over a year. You really need to think about getting some help. It's a lot. The very
Hmm.
next morning, she says, "Hey, would you consider letting me help you? I think it would be really amazing." I actually used to run clinical practices. I graduated as a doctor before you were even born. And I know what you do because of how you've cared for my kids. I think I'd be a really good fit. And I went, I literally cannot find a better person to support me. But the reason that ended up happening, and I think that this is important to the question, is I was available to let her communicate to me what she thought would be interesting because we had already built enough rapport and relationship in a different container that she came to me with that piece of information, with that question, with that curiosity. So I think the context of that I think is really important is for business leaders and solopreneurs. I think it's less about trying to have the right answer or find the right answer and more about cultivating curiosity and also cultivating approachability. Because if I'm curious about what would it look like for me to have a healthier version of my business or my relationships or myself, then what I do is I create a container where I can build rapport with other people where I become approachable because I didn't solicit that. Janet came to me and offered that. And over the last 5 years, the number of support vehicles or the number of supporters that I've had financially, clinically, from a relational standpoint, So many of them, I would say 90% of them have been unsolicited, where somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, would it be possible for me to work with you on the following thing? I know you've not brought it up, but this is where my area of expertise is, and you've helped me. I'd love to be able to support you in that." And they do that because I'm approachable, because I've built rapport, and I've maintained a high level of curiosity. So I think that's a lot more important, to just be open, than it is to be so adamant about having to find the answer by yourself, right? Because it takes a village to raise a family. It takes a lot more to do a business. There's just so many moving parts, right? So I think that's part of it.
That's very interesting. I appreciate that. Um, Anything else regarding the understanding of our weaknesses? I mean, I love your being approachable, maintaining that curiosity and building rapport, which every single one of you out there listening know how to do that. And that just opens up yourself to opportunities. Is there anything else regarding that understanding the weaknesses and then making ourselves available to build around those that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that comes to mind when you ask that, Gabe, is the self awareness of knowing what your triggers are. Right, when you're running a business, there's so many different cliches, but I think one of the best ones is still, it's like jumping off a cliff and building the plane on the way down. I still think that one's a good one. But whatever the colloquialism may be, solopreneurship and entrepreneurship is very, very daunting. It's very intimidating, right? It's very difficult. So neurologically, one of the truths that I communicate to everybody is that when fear goes up, cognition goes down. When you are stressed and you're overloaded, it is hard to think clearly, and it's also difficult to understand how you feel. So when you're doing something like running a business by yourself, never mind adding in the factors of parenting and partnership and all of these other things, if you're not self-aware to know what is creating stress and is creating fatigue and is creating a trigger, you're going to be less likely to know when you get triggered and how you respond, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when your stress level is going to compromise your ability to think clearly or compromise your ability to understand how you feel. So I think part of that is probably one of the most significant things that I would encourage people to do is take an inventory of what your mental and emotional health is, understand what your fatigue is, understand what your self care is. Because you're going to get tired. And when you get tired, it's harder to function in a composed manner. So when you have those spaces where you go, maybe that wasn't the most effective space in terms of leadership, or that wasn't the most effective engagement with a client, or that was a split decision that I made because I was trying to mitigate some fear and pain, and I was trying to pursue some sort of reward. I think from a weakness standpoint, there is no greater tool than increased self awareness. And whatever that looks like, whether it's a Myers Briggs, or it's a Berkman, or it's a DISC, or it's an Enneagram, or it's a life coach, or it's a therapist, or it's a spiritual director. I think having someone who can speak intentionally into your life in a way that can be very honest about how you show up when you get fatigued, tired, stressed, or fearful. It can be some of the most helpful pieces of information on how to navigate how you move forward, especially when you do an audit and you reflect on the ways you showed up when you weren't your best. That can be really informative, I think.
That's fantastic. I appreciate that. So, we are a podcast about money, and we've touched a little bit about money, but I have three questions I ask every one of my guests regarding money. And the first question is, what's the smartest thing you've ever done regarding money?
It's a good question. I think the smartest thing that I've ever done with money, I would still come back to, is understanding my hourly rate and not having shame about that. The sooner that I got comfortable with knowing that I could charge somebody a reasonable amount for my services, and understanding that, I think this is a phrase that I was given that helped me so much. It's not that I need to be aware of how much I'm charging in that hour. It's that I'm communicating to somebody that the amount of work and the tens of thousands of hours that led up to being able to serve you within an hour is what I'm charging somebody for. So for me, the smartest decision was being able to properly understand my value, and understand that I can show up better when I'm not hesitant to connect a financial obligation for my client or my patient to what I'm offering in terms of the service.
That's fantastic. That's a great lesson for anybody listening. Charge for the value that you provide. What's the biggest money mistake you've ever made, and why did it happen? Tell me that story.
Yeah, it's I'll tell you the biggest money mistake, which if anybody's married, I'm sure you've got stories around business decisions as a solopreneur while you're also married to another solopreneur. But I'll tell you the end before the beginning. My biggest mistake was not being on the same page with my partner, with my spouse. Not the actual cost of what I did, but the relational cost of what I did. So I used to work for a clinic system in Texas and Georgia. I was the executive director and one of the lead clinicians for a system that had an unbelievable amount of very high-end, beautiful equipment. I transitioned into private practice and moved away from that company for a number of different reasons. And when they went and ended up closing the clinic and went into bankruptcy, they initiated an auction for all of that equipment. Now, because I wasn't employed and I was in private practice, I was invited to that auction to be able to purchase some of that equipment. And this equipment in functional neurology is very unique. It's very, very custom, right? So the chances of getting equipment at pennies on the dollar is not going to happen again in a lifetime, unless another clinic like this big closes again. So I said to myself, I'm new in practice. I've got an opportunity. I've only been in practice 4 or 5 years, but man, I'm going to get some fantastic equipment. I set a number that I told my wife was going to be my top end that I was going to go for in the auction. And when the auction ended, that number ended up being double. And when I told her that number, we've been married 17 years. Uh, we have had a lot of different things happen. It's the only time in our marriage my wife told me not to come home because she's like, I don't know which version of me is going to show up if you come home. Because I essentially, for the way that she's wired for financial security, my wife grew up in a trailer park. The first house that she lived in was the one that we bought together. So her relationship around finances is similar to my story in terms of scarcity. So essentially, what I did relationally was I pushed her out of an airplane without a parachute on. And it took me about 2 years for that parachute to open because that's how long it took for us to be okay with that. Now, the interesting thing is, it took me 6 months to pay for all of that equipment through revenue because I opened my practice and have no debt in my practice. So I paid it off very quickly. So from the outside, it looks like a brilliant financial decision. Bought incredible equipment, got it pennies on the dollar, paid it off in 6 months, made money off of it, sold and flipped some other equipment, fully furnished my entire clinic with things that would have cost me close to $2 million. But the reason it was the biggest mistake financially was I made a decision at that point without making sure that I was on the same page with my partner. And what ended up happening is it cost us about 2 years of relational conflict to get to a point where she could trust, even though it worked out exactly the way that I had planned. She didn't want to skydive, and I did. And I think that's one of the biggest things to learn in those spaces is you can make really, really, really great financial decisions on paper, and they can be very significant mistakes because it depends on what the bigger value add is for you. And the bigger value add for me in hindsight was relational versus monetary or transactional.
That is a fantastic lesson. Um, it takes me back, and it's nowhere near as eloquent as you've said it. Some of your other wording, but it's kind of like if Mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And Mama was not happy. You pushed her way too far outside of her comfort zone in that decision, even though it all worked. Because you're right, that was a fantastic business decision. But that trust capital got put into the negative for a little while, unfortunately.
It did, and it was a great opportunity as well. And I think this is where I don't think there's anything that's wholly or intrinsically unsalvageable or wrong. I think in that particular space, what it ended up doing was created some really great containers to reinforce for her what was working. Because I also realized at that point the reason that there was so much fear is that the 3 years prior I had never done a budget. My wife had never seen the P&L. She didn't understand how much revenue was there and how much margin was there. So if at any point in the previous 3 years she had had a really clear understanding of what was happening, because we have a very open partnership in terms of understanding what we're doing financially, we have a consolidated financial footprint. But what happened was because she was so uninformed going into that decision, my lack of fear around that was not the same lack of fear that she had. So it wasn't around the decision. It was around the clarity that led up to that decision being one-sided. So because of that, it actually ended up being a really great opportunity to change the structure of how I introduce clarity for her on a more regular basis So now we're at a point where I can make any decision that I want to with the business, and she wholeheartedly trusts me, not because of the rectifying of that particular business decision, but because of the format and the strategy of how I make sure that she's up to date and up to speed in everything that's happening around the nature of what I'm doing financially with the business. That gives her the clarity to go, I don't need to ask questions. I trust you. You inform me well. So I think there's a lot of learning curves in a lot of spaces for sure.
Oh, that's a fantastic lesson, and for those of you listening, that is a great piece for you to go, "Wait a second. I should probably sit down and talk to my spouse, significant other, partner, whatever that situation is, and go, all right, here's what's going on, just so you understand what's going on with my business so that we're on the same page." My wife and I have that conversation quite often, but it's for sure 4 times a year because that's when I do my billing. And I'm like, "Okay, just so you know, here's the revenues, here's the expenses, here's what's going on, here's where we are," so that the plans that we've laid and the things we have in place, she knows we're still on pace. We're still on track to do the things that we're trying to do. So, that is that's a great example. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Last question that I ask of the money questions is, what does mastering your finances mean to you?
I think more than anything, even as I stutter for the first time, because clearly I'm not short on words, I think mastering my finances is knowing that I am in process. For me, it's looking at it and understanding. I don't feel like that's a destination for me personally. When I look at clinical expertise versus clinical mastery, for instance, we know expertise is 10,000 hours, mastery is 40,000. Anecdotally, a lot of people believe that, but mastery is a process. And for me, I cannot master my finances if I don't stay engaged in the skill building of financial understanding. For me, it's something that I tend to avoid. Like, some of us have great relationships with physical exercise, and you've got or athletics, and you see somebody engaged, like us being fans of music. You watch somebody play an instrument, and you go, that person has mastered that instrument. They just know how to do it because they've done it so many times. So for me, mastery of my financial livelihood and financial experience, I think, is more than anything tied to the fact that I just have to practice more often. I have to engage more often and trust that that will happen based on the frequency that I engage. Because I can't expect myself to develop stamina and skill and strength in a muscle if it isn't worked. I certainly can't expect myself to do the same financially if I'm not engaged. So I think the short one word answer for me is financial mastery is directly connected to engagement.
I love that. That's really good. So, this is about the time I normally ask, how can my listeners find you? So, what's the best way for my listeners to find you?
Yeah, fortunately, my URL is really easy. I only have Instagram. I'm not very commonly on social, but there's lots on my website, which is just drjerome.com. So drjerome.com, drjerome.com. And the Instagram is doctor spelled out, DOCTOR, period, Jerome.
Very good. And how about anything you would like to share? Anything that someone could go and download? Any promos? Anything you'd like to share from your website? Anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. On the website, there are e-courses, there are books, there are lots of free podcasts where I've been able to talk about a variety of different topics, from mental, emotional, physical, relational, and kind of spiritual health dynamics. There's a lot of different pieces depending on what someone's approach or desire is to engage. But the biggest thing is there are so many different resources around self care and self development in a process of what we call becoming whole. The goal of all of the content that I create non clinically and all of the clinical services that I provide in the healthcare arena is the phrase that it's not about being less broken, it's about becoming more whole. So everything that you'll find on the website is pointed towards that process of becoming more whole, either through the brain based Enneagram book, our podcast on whole identity, some of the e-courses on self-care. So anything that interests you or sparks your interest on that space. And obviously there's different places for everybody financially. So there's tons and tons of free podcasts, an inexpensive book, or a really robust e-course. So there's a couple of different ways to engage based on wherever you're at.
That's fantastic. Anything else we missed that you'd like to touch on before we let you go?
I think probably the thing that I would leave with, Gabe, in terms of anything that we could touch on is, especially because solopreneurship starts with the word solo, and obviously that feels so much like being on an island. And I'm sure you've had so many other guests mention this, but I just want to reiterate because it bears repeating, especially after the last few years of what we've experienced in the world. That this kind of experience of running a business and doing solopreneurship is still meant to be done in community. You may not have somebody who shares equity in your business. You may not have somebody who shares ownership of what you are doing on a daily basis. But we're designed and built for community. So even as a solopreneur, I would encourage everyone to realize that relationship is not dependent on proximity, right? We're having a great conversation right now. We're not in the same room together. So being able to lean into a community of people who can support you, we need you. We want you to run the business that you run and do the work that you do and offer the service that you offer. It is going to be far more likely for you to succeed and for the work that you're doing to be impactful if you maintain some degree of community. So don't be in isolation, even though you're a solopreneur. Is probably the biggest thing that I would leave everybody with.
That's a great way to end. Jerome, thank you for being on the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Gabe. It was a gift.
Well, solopreneurs, Gabe here. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. There was all kinds of fun information and interesting information in there in that conversation. My three takeaways for you as we close out this podcast. One, self-awareness is key. Get an understanding not only of what you're good at and what you want to do, but what are some of those triggers that are stepping into play that's causing you to go, wait, something's wrong. I need to address this, and I need to either bring somebody on, fix a system, do something different to help me be able to run my life and my business even better. The next thing is connect your value with what you are charging. The world is full of people who are not charging enough for the services that they provide. Make sure you're connecting the value to the fees that you're charging for your services. And the last one is taken right out of his mistake, and that is the regular communication with your significant other. Whoever that person is, or even someone who's helping you make decisions. If you don't have that significant other in your life, have that communication on a regular basis so that someone can understand, especially in a significant other, spousal partner type of situation, when you can give more clarity on what's going on with the finances, and then you start to do things, invest in things, buy things, spend money on things. When your spouse or significant partner is on the same page, it has a tendency to make things go much, much easier. So I really hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please go ahead and share this with a friend and see if we can help this podcast continue to grow.